Malcolm X, the resonant echo of Black power, is not merely a tribute to a singular revolutionary spirit, but an analytical odyssey through the shaping of an icon, whose influence reverberates beyond generations. From the fiery crucible of a racist America to the podiums of the most fervent movements for Black empowerment, Malcolm X's life is both an epic of transformation and a mirror to the perennial struggles confronting Black communities. The world Malcolm inherited was one of relentless adversity, marked by pervasive prejudice and systemic injustice. Born into a family haunted by racial terrorism, young Malcolm was introduced early to the harsh realities of Black existence in America, a country still grappling with the wounds of its own racial contradictions. His formative years, stained by violence and loss, could have been the undoing of a weaker spirit. For Malcolm, they were the kindling for a boundless quest for knowledge, power, and justice. Each chapter of this book is meticulously woven to highlight the critical junctures of Malcolm X's metamorphosis, from the turbulent streets of Harlem, where desperation fueled a descent into crime, to the solitary confinement of prison, where words became weapons and education his salvation. Malcolm's journey is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Within those walls, he rebirthed his identity, reconnecting with his heritage and forever altering the trajectory of his life. Malcolm's affiliation with the Nation of Islam heralded the rise of a vociferous leader. His rapid transformation from an anonymous convert to a formidable spokesman mirrored the urgency of a people desperate for agency. The power of his words, sharp as daggers and laden with conviction, redefined the possibilities of protest. His message, simultaneously radical and nuanced, influenced not only Black America but also challenged the consciousness of an entire society. The chapters ahead delve into the architecture of his activism, dissecting the mechanics of his organizing, the cadence of his oratory, and the strategic brilliance behind his movement building. As a historian and observer, this account endeavors to present Malcolm X not only as a champion of Black power, but as a complex figure whose legacy continues to ignite consciences and spur action. This work seeks to illuminate Malcolm's indelible impact on social justice and examine how his voice, once marginalized, now stands as a clarion call for liberation. The story of Malcolm X is not confined to history. It is a living testament to the power of belief, the necessity for change, and the enduring pursuit of dignity. As you turn each page, may you grasp both the suffering and triumph that underscore his journey, recognizing the echo of Black power as not only his cry but a legacy we are yet to fulfill. Chapter 1: Born in Fire, a childhood shaped by racism. Malcolm Little was born into the furnace of racial unrest, where the embers of hatred smoldered with every passing day. His birthplace, Omaha, Nebraska, in 1925, was a microcosm of a nation standing on the precipice of change, yet anchored deeply in the soil of white supremacy. The social landscape Malcolm entered was riddled with barriers, legal, cultural, and psychological, that segregated and diminished Black lives. The Little family embodied resilience, fighting for survival in a world designed to quell their aspiration. Malcolm's father, Earl Little, was an outspoken Baptist preacher and avid supporter of Marcus Garvey's Back to Africa movement, whose own convictions put the family under constant threat. Vigilante groups like the Ku Klux Klan targeted them repeatedly, seeking to silence their activism with brutality. The home Malcolm remembered was not only a sanctuary from the outside world's hostilities, but often a battlefield within, where hope persevered alongside palpable fear. The earliest memories of young Malcolm were punctuated by terrifying encounters: a burning cross on the family lawn, menacing threats, and the eventual torching of their house, which forced the Littles to move multiple times. The omnipresent specter of violence was not random. It was a deliberate act of racial intimidation meant to keep Black families subservient and silent. As a child, Malcolm internalized these realities, keenly aware of the distinctions society drew between him and the world beyond his skin. The oppressive force of racism was not abstract, it was personal, visceral, and omnipresent. His mother, Louise Little, was a woman of strength and intellect. Her Caribbean heritage infused a sense of pride amidst adversity. and she encouraged Malcolm to question the status quo. Yet, her life too was shattered by relentless racism. The loss of Earl Little, believed murdered in a streetcar accident orchestrated by white supremacists, plunged the family into poverty. Louise struggled under the weight of grief and the economic devastation wrought by discriminatory welfare practices, which actively sought to punish black widows. Malcolm witnessed firsthand how systemic bias went beyond overt violence. It seeped into institutions, shaping destinies. School for Malcolm was fraught with contradiction. He excelled academically, often outshining his peers, but found encouragement fleeting. Teachers scoffed at his ambitions, telling him that as a black boy, aspiration of becoming a lawyer were not realistic. Such dismissiveness was not merely discouraging, it was part of a larger tapestry of institutional racism that sought to limit black potential at every turn. For Malcolm, these formative moments ignited a sense of indignation and fostered his early skepticism of white benevolence. He realized that the world's fairness did not extend to those who looked like him. Despite or perhaps because of these hardships, Malcolm developed a fierce intelligence and adaptability. He became acutely observant of the power dynamics around him, internalizing lessons about trust, ambition, and survival. The little children scattered as social services intervened, and Malcolm was placed in foster care, a system replete with its own prejudices. Even in these temporary homes, he grappled with the feeling of otherness, his identity under constant scrutiny and attack. The flame of racism that marked Malcolm's childhood did not consume his spirit. Instead, it forged it. The very adversities he faced became a crucible for strength, setting the foundation for his later strategies as an activist. He learned to question authority, to distrust systems that promised equality but delivered oppression. His earliest years spent confronting the ugly realities of America's racial hierarchy, birthed a consciousness that would one day challenge and ultimately help transform society. This chapter thus lays bare the formative pressures of Malcolm's upbringing, not as isolated incidents, but as integral components of his worldview. Every loss, every slight, every act of violence contributed to the evolution of a mind destined to become a voice for the dispossessed. As the story unfolds, the heat of those early fires emerges not simply as destructive, but as the energy from which Malcolm X would draw his unwavering commitment to justice. Chapter 2: A Broken Home, Loss, Violence, and Survival. The disintegration of Malcolm X's childhood home was marked by a chain of tragedies that would irrevocably shape his path. The death of Earl Little was the first in a series of blows that fragmented the family unit and set Malcolm adrift in a world rife with uncertainty. For Malcolm, loss was not a singular event, but a recurrent theme, each calamity etching itself into the very core of his being. Earl Little's violent and suspicious death was presented by authorities as an accident, yet Malcolm and his siblings long believed it to be the result of white terror. This loss, coupled with the knowledge that justice would not be served, instilled in Malcolm a sense of disillusionment toward law enforcement and government entities. His mother, Louise, now left to provide for 8 children, became the embodiment of strained resilience. She fought not only the daily rigors of motherhood, but a system designed to undermine black families, stripping them of their economic and emotional foundation. Survival became the family's modus operandi. Louise struggled under the dual pressures of societal marginalization and psychological trauma. Welfare agencies, ostensibly created to aid the needy, exploited their authority to assert control and break apart black homes deemed unfit. Malcolm observed how these interventions were seldom neutral, targeting families for reasons less about neglect and more about race and social conformity. The state's decision to institutionalize Louise was a devastating final blow, resulting in the dispersal of her children across foster homes and orphanages, a practice all too common among African American families facing adversity. For Malcolm, these changes were more than mere logistics. They were formative experiences of abandonment and alienation. The foster care system, while comparatively stable to the chaos that preceded it, offered little warmth or understanding. Malcolm encountered homes where difference was highlighted, and he was often made conscious of his outsider status. The physical separation from his siblings added to the sense of fractured identity, as each child was forced to navigate a new environment without the comfort of kin. In this atmosphere of instability and emotional distress, Malcolm began to develop a hardened exterior, masking vulnerability with bravado. He learned early the value of adaptability, reading the intentions of adults, navigating social situations, and, above all, concealing his pain. His encounters with teachers and social workers deepened his skepticism. The guidance offered by white authority figures was often patronizing and dismissive, focusing on conformity rather than genuine uplift. Despite the hardships, Malcolm's intellect remained undiminished. He sharpened his wit and broadened his perspective, reading voraciously and observing the world with acute precision. The rejection he faced in school and foster homes further catalyzed his determination to succeed on terms defined by himself, no longer seeking the approval of systems that had failed him and his family. The cumulative effect of loss and violence was a worldview grounded in realism and resistance. Malcolm saw firsthand the consequences of systemic neglect and understood the necessity of self-reliance. The emotional wounds of his early adolescence did not heal easily, yet they cultivated a tenacity that would serve him in later struggles. He refused to be defined by the limitations others imposed. This defiance, born out of suffering, would become the cornerstone of his activism. This chapter is not a catalogue of victimhood, but a narrative of endurance. Through loss, Malcolm forged an identity capable of confronting adversity. His ability to survive physically, emotionally, and intellectually is a testimony to the strength found in the margins. The chaos of his broken home offered lessons in resilience, kinship, and resistance, making him uniquely prepared to navigate the perils that awaited him in adulthood. As we follow Malcolm from his fractured childhood toward the turbulent streets of Harlem, the legacy of loss is ever present. It informs his choices but does not dictate his destiny. Malcolm X's story is thus a reminder that within the crucible of pain lie the seeds of power, waiting to germinate in the fertile ground of consciousness and purpose. Chapter 3: Streets of Harlem, Crime, Hustling, and Prison. Embarking upon the fraught streets of Harlem, Malcolm Little entered a world altogether different from the rural terrains of his youth. Harlem in the 1940s was not just a geographical location, it was an epicenter of black culture, vibrancy, and, paradoxically, desperation. Every block pulsed with energy, creativity, and the omnipresent struggle for survival. It was here, amid the bustle of nightclubs, jazz, and illicit enterprise, that Malcolm's journey wove into the fabric of urban life. Malcolm's initial arrival in Harlem was marked by awe and a sense of belonging that had eluded him for years. The community was alive with voices that spoke to black experience, yet economic hardship and racial barriers remained. Opportunities for advancement were slim, with legitimate employment scarce and discrimination pervasive. For many young men like Malcolm, hustling became not a choice, but a necessity, the only viable means to secure livelihood and status. Quickly, Malcolm adapted, his sharp intellect and charisma serving as currency in the underground economy. He moved through the interlocking worlds of gambling, drug dealing, and petty theft, acquiring a reputation for cleverness and resourcefulness. The skills honed during his years of familial instability now proved advantageous, allowing him to navigate perilous situations with shrewdness. Harlem's nightlife, with its blend of glamour and danger, became the stage upon which Malcolm would forge his streetwise persona. The exposure to crime, however, bore a double-edged sword. Material comfort was fleeting, and the constant threat of violence was never far away. Malcolm witnessed firsthand the devastating toll illicit activities took on the community, perpetuating cycles of addiction, incarceration, and exploitation. The law, ever vigilant, maintained a presence that was as predatory as the criminals it sought to police. For black residents, justice was rarely impartial. Racial profiling and brutality were routine. Malcolm's own trajectory was inevitably interrupted by arrest and imprisonment. Caught in a burglary scheme gone awry, he was sentenced to prison, a fate common to many young black men marked by poverty and restricted opportunity. The initial shock of confinement was profound, stripping away the illusion of invincibility cultivated on the streets. prison was unyielding, designed to break spirits and reinforce the boundaries of social hierarchy. Yet within those stark walls, Malcolm's life would undergo a profound shift. The monotony and isolation of prison forced reflection. The loss of freedom compelled an evaluation of choices and values. This environment, intended to repress, became a crucible for transformation. Malcolm saw the parallels between the systemic oppression outside and the microcosm of prisoner society where race and power operated with ruthless efficiency. The story of Malcolm's Harlem years is more than a chronicle of crime. It is a narrative saturated with survival, ingenuity, and the search for meaning in a broken system. Hustling, while destructive, was a symptom rather than a causal response to exclusion and the structural limitations imposed by a society reluctant to extend genuine opportunities to Black Americans. His experiences exposed the hypocrisy of laws that criminalized poverty. While perpetuating inequality, Malcolm's eventual incarceration would prove pivotal. The same fire that drove him to the streets would fuel his yearning for self-discovery and elevation. The lessons gleaned from Harlem's shadowy corners now formed the foundation for deeper introspection. His time on the margins, rough as it was, prepared him for the radical transformation awaiting him behind bars. In this chapter, Malcolm's immersion into Harlem's underbelly and subsequent imprisonment are examined, not simply for their criminal dimension, but as critical junctures in the forging of a revolutionary. The narrative is one of movement from chaos to order, from survival to awakening. The Harlem years, with all their triumphs and failures, were the prelude to a rebirth that would echo far beyond the prison walls. Chapter 4. The Prison Awakening, Education Behind Bars. Inside the sterile confines of Charlestown State Prison, Malcolm Little's life entered an unforeseen phase of transformation. The initial months were grueling, a stark environment, stripped of distraction, where the weight of regret and futility lay heavy. Yet, it was within these very limitations that Malcolm discovered the boundless horizon of intellectual possibility. The catalyst for change came in the form of self-directed education. Isolation created space for reflection, and Malcolm soon rejected the resignation that prison was meant to instill. He immersed himself in reading, voraciously consuming every book available in the prison library. From philosophy to history, literature to religion, Malcolm recognized in books the power to open windows into worlds previously inaccessible. A key influence during this period was Bimby, an inmate whose eloquence and command of knowledge inspired Malcolm to recognize the potential of disciplined study. Under Bimby's mentorship, Malcolm began to reconstruct the fragments of his identity, shedding the defensive bravado of his hustling years in favor of curiosity, discipline, and self-mastery. Dictionaries became his constant companions, and he dedicated months to copying words and definitions, building a vocabulary that would later serve as the foundation for his rhetorical power. This metamorphosis was not merely intellectual, it was spiritual. Exposure to the teachings of Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam through letters and conversations provided Malcolm with an alternative vision for Black identity. The doctrines of self-respect, discipline, and resistance to oppression resonated deeply. For the first time, Malcolm encountered a system of thought that challenged the inferiority imposed by the dominant white culture and offered a new sense of purpose. The juxtaposition between the oppressive realities of prison and the liberating potential of self-education marked a defining epoch in Malcolm's life. He began to see himself as part of a broader historical struggle, reading about slavery, colonialism, and civil rights movements. Malcolm traced the lineage of Black resistance to his own predicament. The walls of confinement faded in significance as his consciousness expanded. Malcolm's dedication to study was relentless. He often spent hours late into the night, reading by the glow of a small light. His intellectual development unfolded in tandem with a growing commitment to activism. He corresponded with family, fellow inmates, and members of the Nation of Islam, articulating his developing ideas about race, power, and justice. Prison became less a place of punishment and more a crucible for personal and ideological refinement. The social dynamics in prison further shaped Malcolm's perspective. He observed how race, class, and status operated within the institution, often mirroring or exaggerating the prejudices of the outside world. Black prisoners faced harsher punishments, limited resources, and constant surveillance. These observations deepened Malcolm's distrust of American institutions and invigorated his resolve to fight systemic injustice upon release. By the time Malcolm's sentence concluded, he left prison not as the man he had been, but as an intellectual and spiritual combatant. The education forged behind bars, both in formal knowledge and in personal philosophy, prepared him for the rigors of leadership. The discipline cultivated in confinement would become central to his method of organizing and mobilizing movements. This chapter underscores the transformative power of education and introspection. Prison was intended to stifle and destroy, but in Malcolm's case, it became the breeding ground for the radicalization of a leader. The awakening was both personal and political. It redefined the very purpose of his existence. Malcolm X emerged from prison with a new name, a fresh sense of identity, and a burning urgency to confront the forces that had shaped and attempted to shatter his life. Chapter 5: The Nation of Islam, a New Identity is Born. Upon release from prison, Malcolm X entered a new phase with a fervor that could only be described as revolutionary. The Nation of Islam offered more than a religious community. It presented a comprehensive worldview that reimagined black identity, dignity, and agency. Under the leadership of Elijah Muhammad, the organization preached a potent mixture of self-reliance, discipline, and unapologetic resistance to white dominance. Malcolm's swift ascension within the nation was predicated on the congruence between its teachings and the insights formed during his years of personal struggle and prison education. The doctrines of moral rigor, economic empowerment, and racial pride resonated deeply. The rejection of surnames inherited from slave masters and the adoption of X as a symbol of anonymity and lost heritage was both a personal and political statement. Malcolm X was now an agent of transformation, his very name a challenge to historical erasure. His initial roles within the organization were unassuming, yet Malcolm's charisma and clarity of conviction quickly distinguished him. He became a key recruiter, increasing membership exponentially as he traveled from city to city, speaking in churches, mosques, and community halls. His message was direct: black people must reject the inferiority imposed by centuries of oppression and build institutions capable of fulfilling their own needs. The appeal was magnetic, particularly to those alienated by mainstream American society and the slow progress of integrationist civil rights efforts. Malcolm's ability to articulate the grievances of Black America made him invaluable to the Nation of Islam. He emphasized the importance of disciplined abstinence from alcohol, drugs, and indulgence and called for self-sufficiency through black-owned businesses and educational structures. His speeches resonated with urgency, framing the struggle not as a request for acceptance but as a demand for justice and equality. The message was confrontational and unapologetic, challenging both white supremacy and what he perceived as the passivity of traditional leadership. Controversy accompanied Malcolm's rise. Mainstream media and law enforcement agencies viewed both him and the Nation of Islam as threats to the status quo. Surveillance, character assassination, and legislative scrutiny ensued. Malcolm, unbowed, used these challenges to further galvanize support, highlighting the contradiction between American ideals and the lived reality of black citizens. The more he was attacked, the greater his legitimacy in the eyes of marginalized audiences. Within the Nation of Islam, Malcolm's role continued to evolve. He became the principal spokesman, the face and voice of the movement, skillful in both debate and oratory. He mastered the art of communicating complex ideas in ways accessible to both the educated and uneducated, effectively uniting diverse audiences under a banner of racial pride and collective action. Malcolm's embrace of the nation was transformative, signaling the emergence of a figure whose identity was inseparable from his mission. His leadership style was characterized by rigorous discipline, personal sacrifice, and an absolute commitment to his cause. He ushered luxury and comfort, living modestly to demonstrate solidarity with the movement's principles. Yet, the alliance with the Nation of Islam also sowed seeds for future conflict. as Malcolm's fame grew. So, too did internal tensions. The organization became wary of his growing influence and independent thinking. Nonetheless, this period stands as a vital epoch in Malcolm's evolution, marking his transition from a seeker of truth to a bearer of it. This chapter captures the birth of Malcolm's new identity, forged in the crucible of faith and radical resistance. No longer merely reacting to the forces that had shaped his life, Malcolm now emerged as an intentional architect of change. The Nation of Islam was both a sanctuary and a launching pad, equipping Malcolm X with the ideological and organizational tools needed to ignite a movement whose impact would resonate across history. Chapter 6: The Rise of Malcolm X from Convert to Spokesman. Malcolm X's ascendancy from obscurity to national prominence constitutes one of the most remarkable transformations in American social history. Born Malcolm Little on May 19, 1925, his early years were overshadowed by loss and adversity. The son of a Baptist preacher who was murdered by white supremacists, and a mother broken by grief and institutionalization, Malcolm's formative environment imbued in him both a visceral awareness of racial oppression and a budding sense of resistance. Malcolm's youthful descent into crime, a circumstance shaped by poverty and alienation, ultimately led to his incarceration at the Charlestown State Prison. It was within the confines of a prison cell that he experienced a pivotal metamorphosis. At the urging of his siblings, Malcolm began engaging with the teachings of the Nation of Islam, finding spiritual solace and intellectual challenge in its doctrines. Under the mentorship of Elijah Muhammad, Malcolm discarded the identity of Little, adopting X as a symbol of lost African heritage and a direct repudiation of the legacy of slavery. Malcolm's embrace of Islam proved to be more than a spiritual rebirth. It was a springboard into activism. Immersed in study, he developed a keen analytical mind, questioning both the world as it was and his own place within it. The Nation of Islam's messages, black self-sufficiency, discipline, and separatism, resonated deeply with Malcolm's experiences and aspiration. His raw talent for communication quickly proved indispensable. He became a dynamic recruiter and an unwavering advocate for Elijah Muhammad's message. Upon his release, Malcolm X threw himself into organizing for the Nation of Islam. His energy was prodigious, his charisma undeniable, establishing temples in Detroit, Boston, Philadelphia, and Harlem. He rapidly expanded the movement's reach. His presence galvanized black communities, offering a new mode of pride, purpose, and action. Malcolm's prowess as a spokesman was rooted in authenticity. He spoke as one who had suffered, who understood the wounds of his people. His sermons, incisive and unvarnished, conveyed not only the urgency of the Nation of Islam's mission, but also the broader liberation struggle. Through radio interviews, newspaper editorials, and public rallies, Malcolm X advanced a message that was both a rallying cry and a rebuke. Challenging black Americans to embrace self-respect and accountability, his profile soared, attracting admirers and adversaries alike. Media outlets frequently sought his commentary, finding in him both a lightning rod and a voice of uncompromising principle. Malcolm cut an imposing figure, unapologetic, articulate, and unyielding. For many, he became the embodiment of black pride. For others, a threat to the status quo. Malcolm X's role as spokesman, however, gradually evolved. As he gained experience, he deepened his critique of American society, positioning the struggle for black liberation within the broader context of colonialism and global power. He began to interrogate not only white supremacy, but also intra-black dynamics, urging unity, discipline, and moral rigor. The development of these ideas laid the foundation for later challenges both to the Nation of Islam and the broader civil rights movement. This chapter, then, concludes with the emergence of Malcolm X as not merely a convert, but an agent of transformation. His ascent as a spokesman marked a radical inflection point for African American activism, inaugurating a voice that would both inspire and unsettle. It was a voice forged in adversity, sharpened by intellect, and honed in service of a vision that reached far beyond its original context, setting the stage for the seismic shifts to come. Chapter 7: The Power of Words. Oratory and influence. At the heart of Malcolm X's activism lay his singular command of language, a mastery that elevated him above his contemporaries and rendered his speeches landmarks of political oratory. The power of his words emerged as an essential vehicle for both awakening consciousness and driving the momentum of the Black Power movement. Malcolm X's speeches were distinguished by their clarity, force, and uncompromising candor. He spoke directly to the lived experiences of Black Americans, employing vivid imagery and surgical precision to articulate the pain, anger, and aspiration of his audience. His rhetorical strategies were calculated and effective. He deployed repetition to reinforce key themes, asked probing questions to invite reflection, and harnessed analogy to forge emotional connections. Unlike many of his peers within the civil rights community, Malcolm did not shy away from confrontation. His language, unfiltered and confrontational, was a deliberate tool of provocation. He called out hypocrisy in white America, exposed the double standards of justice, and openly challenged Black Americans to cast off a legacy of submission. Phrases such as "by any means necessary" and "the ballot or the bullet" became rallying cries, crystallizing his vision of proactive resistance. The media played a substantial role in amplifying Malcolm X's message. His interviews and televised debates were often charged, filled with moments that forced the nation to reckon with uncomfortable truths, rather than catering to respectability. Malcolm X unraveled the myths of integration and instead presented the urgency of Black nationalism and self-defense. In doing so, he redefined the terms of the ongoing struggle and expanded its moral dimensions. Malcolm's influence extended beyond members of the Nation of Islam. College campuses, local organizations, and international fora all sought his perspective. His speeches at universities such as Oxford and Columbia introduced his message to new audiences, sparking dialogue and inciting action. His engagement with intellectual circles further solidified his reputation as a thinker, as well as an activist. Crucially, Malcolm X's oratory was not simply about opposition. He employed storytelling and historical analysis to connect disparate threads of Black experience. By linking the struggles of Harlem to anti-colonial movements abroad, he revealed the interconnectedness of oppression and the necessity for global solidarity. This approach broadened the reach and relevance of his words, transforming local grievances into universal demands for justice. Malcolm X also invoked a moral imperative in his speeches. He grounded his arguments in principles of self-respect and dignity, urging his listeners to reclaim their humanity in the face of systematic degradation. The effect was galvanizing. Individuals found in his words both a mirror for their suffering and a map for action. The legacy of Malcolm X's rhetoric endures as a cornerstone of activist discourse. His ability to mobilize, inspire, and provoke remains unmatched, setting a benchmark for generations of leaders and organizers. Through his words, Malcolm X catalyzed a movement not only with what he said, but with how he said it. His oratory was, in essence, a form of leadership, one that compelled both reflection and rebellion, planting the seeds of transformation in all who heard his call. Chapter 8: The Making of a Movement, Organizing Black America. Having established himself as a dynamic spokesman, Malcolm X turned his gaze toward the formidable task of movement building. His efforts to organize Black America went far beyond symbolic leadership. They embodied a vision of collective empowerment rooted in structure, discipline, and redefinition of identity. Malcolm X's organizational strategies began with the expansion of the Nation of Islam's reach. As he traveled city to city, he dedicated himself to establishing temples, recruiting members, and training cadres of activists. His approach was methodical, identifying local leaders, cultivating networks of support, and ensuring that the movement's principles inflected daily life. Through rigorous educational programs, community outreach, and employment initiatives, the Nation of Islam under Malcolm's guidance became both a spiritual refuge and a nucleus of Black self-determination, the Black Power movement that emerged in the larger wake of Malcolm X's efforts was shaped by a rejection of passive resistance. Malcolm argued for economic independence, urging Black-owned businesses, cooperative ventures, and mutual aid networks. He eschewed dependency, proposing that only through self-sufficiency could black communities achieve true autonomy and withstand the assaults of systemic racism. Malcolm X's organizing style was unique in its blend of philosophy and pragmatism. His speeches often translated into concrete action, whether through voter registration drives, educational seminars, or self-defense workshops. He encouraged members to adopt disciplined habits, from dietary regulations to financial stewardship, reinforcing communal solidarity and elevating collective morale. Community security was another cornerstone of Malcolm's organizing. While the mainstream civil rights movement prioritized pacifist tactics, Malcolm X advocated for the right of self-defense against racial violence. This stance was not merely rhetorical but manifest in patrols, surveillance, and the cultivation of resilience among movement members. His belief that dignity required both self-respect and physical security was a direct response to the realities of segregationist aggression. Importantly, Malcolm X worked tirelessly to connect local organizing to global struggle. He saw Black America as part of a wider diaspora, invoking images of African liberation and anti-imperialist revolutions to inspire unity and purpose. The establishment of sister organizations and communication with activists abroad signaled a vision that transcended borders, a movement seeking not only civil rights but human emancipation. Malcolm X's effectiveness as an organizer was aided by his capacity to adapt. In the face of setbacks, internal dissent, and external hostility, he demonstrated a remarkable resilience. He was willing to reassess tactics, rethink alliances, and evolve his philosophy. These qualities positioned him as a leader of enduring relevance, whose methods continue to inform contemporary organizing. In sum, Malcolm X's role in the making of a movement was both structural and visionary. His insistence on discipline, independence, and self-defense set a new standard for Black activism. He understood that organization was the lifeblood of progress, turning passion into power and hope into action. Through his example, Malcolm X left behind not only a message, but a blueprint for collective transformation. Chapter 9. Clash with the civil rights mainstream. As Malcolm X's stature grew, so too did his ideological divergence from the mainstream civil rights movement. The period of the early 1960s was marked by both cooperation and conflict, as the strategies and philosophies of leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. collided with the militant vision espoused by Malcolm X. At the heart of this clash were differing conceptions of the road to racial justice. The mainstream movement, led by organizations such as the Southern Christian Leadership Conference (SCLC) and the NAACP, adhered to tactics of non-violent protest and legal redress. Their philosophy was grounded in integration, appealing to America's highest ideals and seeking to expand the promise of citizenship to all. Malcolm X, by contrast, dismissed appeals to white conscience and legislative measures as insufficient. He insisted that the wounds of slavery and segregation required more than reconciliation. They demanded radical change. To Malcolm, the language of integration sounded naive, undercutting Black self-determination and masking the persistence of white supremacy. Public debates between Malcolm X and civil rights leaders were often tense and illuminating. Malcolm accused the mainstream of begging for crumbs, contending that non-violence in the face of brutal repression amounted to abdication of dignity. He flagged the limitations of marches, sit-ins, and boycotts, challenging whether such tactics actually confronted the roots of oppression. Notably, the media exploited this ideological divide, framing Malcolm X as the angry militant and King as the gentle reformer. However, this dichotomy oversimplified a complex relationship. Malcolm X respected the courage and organizational skill of mainstream activists, but believed their vision was circumscribed. He argued for a more expansive framework, one that included international solidarity, economic independence, and strategic self-defense. The tension between Malcolm X and the mainstream extended to their respective political alliances. While the mainstream sought support from liberal politicians and white allies, Malcolm X warned against over-reliance on external validation. He anticipated the pitfalls of cooptation and dilution, advocating instead for black-led initiatives free from compromise. Ultimately, this clash of ideologies produced both friction and creative tension. It forced the civil rights movement to articulate its principles more clearly, and encouraged new forms of activism, including the eventual emergence of organizations such as SNCC and the Black Panther Party. Malcolm X's contribution lay in his insistence on confronting hard truths. By refusing to sanitize the narrative of struggle, he broadened the conversation about freedom. His critiques compelled the movement to contend with issues of agency, identity, and strategy, making the pursuit of justice not only a matter of policy, but of principle. It is this legacy of challenge and debate that continues to shape the contours of black activism today. Chapter 10: The Shadow of Elijah Muhammad, Doubt and Disillusion. Malcolm X's relationship with Elijah Muhammad, leader of the Nation of Islam, was profoundly formative, yet ultimately fraught with disillusionment. Their alliance, rooted in shared vision and mutual respect, would over time confront the inescapable shadow of betrayal, doubt, and ideological fracture. Elijah Muhammad represented both a spiritual father and intellectual mentor to Malcolm X. Under his tutelage, Malcolm found the discipline, purpose, and philosophical grounding that transformed his life. The Nation of Islam's teachings became Malcolm's own, shaping his identity and public persona. He admired Muhammad's insistence on black self-sufficiency, his critique of white supremacy, and his emphasis on moral regeneration. As Malcolm's fame grew, however, tensions surfaced. The expanding influence of Malcolm X inevitably called into question the boundaries of authority. Some within the Nation of Islam feared that Malcolm's charismatic leadership might eclipse Muhammad's own stature. Whispers of rivalry and internal jealousies became increasingly pronounced. Complicating matters were rumors and revelations concerning Elijah Muhammad's personal conduct. Reports surfaced alleging sexual relationships with multiple secretaries' actions, violating the strict moral codes that underpinned the nation's teachings. For Malcolm X, these revelations constituted a profound crisis of faith. He had built his public reputation on the basis of discipline and integrity, values now seemingly betrayed at the movement's highest levels. Malcolm initially sought to suppress his doubts, compartmentalizing personal disappointment in the service of the greater cause. Yet the cognitive dissonance grew intolerable. His public silence was contrasted by internal turmoil, a struggle between loyalty and principle that mirrored broader questions about leadership and accountability within the movement. The assassination of President John F. Kennedy in November 1963 added fuel to these tensions. Malcolm X's comment that the assassination was a case of the chickens coming home to roost provoked widespread controversy and led to a public censure by Elijah Muhammad. The episode deepened Malcolm's sense of marginalization and exposed the precariousness of his position. Ultimately, Malcolm X was compelled to confront the reality that the movement he had worked to build was compromised by the flaws of its leadership. His growing advocacy for broader forms of black nationalism and human rights diverged from the increasingly parochial stance of Elijah Muhammad. The resulting estrangement, painful and irrevocable, forced Malcolm to seek new sources of inspiration and community. This period of doubt and disillusion did not diminish Malcolm X's commitment to justice. Rather, it propelled him toward greater clarity, autonomy, and reinvention. The experience underscored the dangers of uncritical allegiance and the necessity for movements to ground themselves in principles beyond personality. In reflecting on the shadow of Elijah Muhammad, Malcolm X emerged not only changed, but equipped for the next stage of his journey, a stage defined by independence and renewed vision. Chapter 11: Breaking Away, Leaving the Nation of Islam. Malcolm X's decision to sever ties with the Nation of Islam marked a turning point of seismic consequence. The process of breaking away was fraught with emotional pain, institutional fallout, and a profound search for new paradigms, not only for Malcolm himself, but for the contours of black activism writ large. The break was precipitated by overlapping crises. the revelations about Elijah Muhammad's personal conduct, and the organizational censure. Following Malcolm's remarks on Kennedy's assassination deepened the rift within the nation. Suspicions grew that Malcolm's loyalty was wavering. Threats, intimidation, and ostracism followed, creating an atmosphere of mutual distrust. Malcolm X's departure was not impulsive. It was the culmination of months of introspection and strategic calculation. He understood the risks involved: loss of community, alienation, and exposure to physical danger. Yet Malcolm's commitment to truth and liberation compelled him forward. In public statements, he acknowledged the virtues of the Nation of Islam, but insisted on the necessity of moving beyond its limitations. The process of breaking away required Malcolm X to redefine both personal and political identity. He established the Muslim Mosque, Inc., intended as a vehicle for religious dialogue and community empowerment. The organization of Afro-American unity soon followed, emblematic of Malcolm's reoriented vision, one that prioritized black solidarity, political education, and internationalism. This period of transition was marked by both uncertainty and innovation. Cut off from the institutional support he once relied upon, Malcolm was forced to cultivate new alliances. Grassroots activists, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens reached out, recognizing in Malcolm's leadership a rare combination of integrity and strategic acuity. The threats facing Malcolm X grew increasingly acute. Surveillance, harassment, and the specter of assassination loomed relentlessly. Nevertheless, Malcolm pressed onward, traveling extensively and delivering speeches that showcased his evolving philosophy. He stressed the importance of self-definition, collective action, and the embrace of global human rights frameworks. Breaking away, Malcolm X became more than a symbol of defiance. He became a beacon for the transformative possibilities of principled dissent. He challenged his followers to think critically, to question authority, and to link personal liberation to collective emancipation. The organizations he founded did not replicate the insularity of the Nation of Islam. They sought instead to build bridges across faiths, nationalities, and movements. Malcolm's departure also facilitated a reconciliation between black nationalism and broader civil rights activism. He began to meet and collaborate with leaders he once opposed, recognizing the necessity for unity in the face of common foes. He advocated political literacy, economic self-sufficiency, and an unwavering commitment to the dignity of all people. In sum, Malcolm X's break from the Nation of Islam was a crucible of transformation. It laid bare the challenges of leadership and the perils of institutional dogma. More importantly, it unleashed a new era of activism, one internally coherent, outwardly engaged, and spiritually renewed. Malcolm X thus emerged not diminished by the loss, but expanded by the possibilities it rendered visible. Chapter 12. Journey to Mecca, Transformation of Belief. Malcolm X's departure from the Nation of Islam did not merely sever ties with a religious community. It initiated an odyssey of spiritual rediscovery that would profoundly transform his worldview. In the spring of 1964, thrust into ideological uncertainty and seeking both solace and revelation, Malcolm embarked upon the Hajj. The sacred pilgrimage to Mecca required of all Muslims able to undertake it. This journey, more than any other, would mark the pivot of Malcolm's beliefs from the insular tenets of black separatism to an inclusive vision of universal brotherhood. The Hajj was, for Malcolm, both awakening and reckoning. Arriving in Saudi Arabia, Malcolm encountered a world astonishingly different from the racial divides and prejudices of the United States. The sacred city drew together throngs of pilgrims, white, black, brown, from every nation, united in a collective act of devotion, transcending the boundaries of ethnicity and national origin. Here, in an atmosphere charged with humility before the divine, Malcolm experienced firsthand the possibilities of genuine equality and solidarity. His initial observations challenged decades of ingrained perceptions, having been schooled in the Nation of Islam's rigid racialized theology. Malcolm expected to find that color would continue to define interpersonal relations. Instead, he was received with honor and kinship by Muslims from places as varied as the former Soviet Union, Nigeria and Indonesia. At meals, he sat beside men whose blonde hair and blue eyes would have marked them privileged in America, but who treated him with the same dignity as fellow pilgrims from the heart of Africa. Malcolm's letters and public reflections from Mecca are testaments to this transformation. He wrote with awe of Muslims, of all colors and races coming together as one. No longer content to view white people through the prism of collective guilt, Malcolm now saw potential in the creation of a world order built on justice, compassion, and shared humanity. The enduring legacy of this experience lay in its power to dismantle the psychological chains of American racism and to replace them with a spiritual fraternity capable of bridging the deepest divides. Intellectually, the Hajj catalyzed a fundamental reappraisal of Malcolm's political commitments. If true Islam could unite people past the barrier of race, then perhaps the struggle for black liberation need not be waged through isolation, but through solidarity with all the oppressed. This insight yielded a radical shift from advocating for civil rights anchored purely in the context of black identity, to championing human rights as the birthright of every individual, irrespective of background. Returning from Mecca, Malcolm X sought to disseminate these new convictions far and wide. He established the Organization of Afro-American Unity, modeled after the Organization of African Unity, inviting activists and intellectuals of every ethnicity and faith to join in the struggle. He articulated a vision of liberation that transcended the parochial boundaries of American politics, linking the plight of black Americans to the anti-colonial movements of Africa and Asia. For Malcolm, the Hajj was not merely a journey across continents. It was a passage from a politics of division to a politics of emancipation, rooted in dignity and equal standing before God. Yet, this transformation did not occur without opposition. Many former allies viewed Malcolm's new inclusivity with suspicion, fearing it would dilute the potency of black nationalism. Rivals and adversaries seized upon his changing rhetoric, questioning his loyalty and stability. But Malcolm was resolute. His journey to Mecca had carved an unbreakable conviction, one that would define his activism for the remainder of his life. Ultimately, Malcolm X's pilgrimage stands as a testament to the power of transformation. It proved that even the most ardent ideologue could be touched, changed, and expanded through authentic encounters with other ways of being and believing. The Hajj echoes throughout Malcolm's legacy, a call to unity, dignity, and the indivisible value of every human soul. Chapter 13. Malcolm's New Vision: Human Rights over Civil Rights. Malcolm X's worldview after his pilgrimage to Mecca marked a profound departure from his earlier advocacy. No longer content with the limited scope of civil rights, the legal battle for equal treatment under American law, Malcolm adopted a global perspective, repositioning his activism within the broader framework of human rights. This recalibration, as bold as it was controversial, would place him at the vanguard of a new era of black radical thought and international solidarity. Historically, the civil rights movement was grounded in challenging America's constitutional betrayals, the denial of voting access, public accommodations, and fair employment. For leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. and organizations such as the NAACP, the goal was integration into the democratic fabric, the full extension of rights already theoretically enshrined under American law. Malcolm, however, argued that the American legal system, rooted in colonialism and white supremacy, was inherently incapable of securing true justice for black people. If the courts and government had for centuries perpetuated violence and disenfranchisement, then asking those institutions for redress was a doomed endeavor. Malcolm's passage from civil rights to human rights was both personal and theoretical. In Mecca and throughout his travels in Africa and Europe, Malcolm witnessed liberation movements challenging the vestiges of colonialism, demanding not integration but independence, dignity, and recognition as equals on the world stage. He saw black American struggles mirrored in Algerian anti-colonial fighters, Ghanaian revolutionaries, and South African anti-apartheid activists. The common thread was clear. The battle was not only for legal parity within oppressive states, but for existential recognition as full human beings. This realization led Malcolm X to advocate for bringing American racial grievances before the United Nations, framing them not as domestic disputes but as matters of international human rights. His Organization of Afro-American Unity drafted statements and appeals seeking to elevate the plight of Black Americans to the level of global concern. Such a move was radical, suggesting that the U.S. government's refusal to protect Black lives constituted a violation of treaty law and universal principles. Malcolm insisted that civil rights battles, though necessary, were insufficient as long as the structures wielding power remained fundamentally hostile to Black existence. He urged Black communities to articulate their pain and struggle in terms that transcended geographic boundaries. The Black American, he proclaimed, was part of a larger family of humanity oppressed, yet undaunted, standing in solidarity with others seeking liberation from tyranny. This vision alarmed many within the mainstream civil rights movement, who feared internationalizing the issue would threaten fragile alliances with liberal politicians or open them up to Cold War scrutiny. Malcolm's readiness to engage with leaders from Africa, Asia, and Latin America made him an object of suspicion for the American authorities, who worried that externalizing the racial crisis could foster radicalism and global embarrassment. Nevertheless, Malcolm persisted in speeches, interviews, and public writings. He reframed the Black struggle as a fight for human dignity and equal share of humanity's promise, not just amelioration under a broken system. He spoke passionately about the right to self-defense, cultural pride, and the necessity of forging transnational alliances. His words reverberated beyond America, inspiring activists from London to Lusaka, and mapping new strategies for liberation rooted in international law and cross-cultural fellowship. Malcolm X's embrace of human rights marked an enduring shift from narrow reformism to revolutionary change, from local battles to global solidarity. In doing so, he laid the groundwork not only for the Black Power movement, but for decades of anti-racist, anti-colonial, and human rights advocacy that would follow him, a legacy that would prove impossible to silence. Chapter 14: A Man Under Watch, Threats, Surveillance, and Isolation. The price of transformation for Malcolm X came not merely in emotional isolation and ideological recalibration, but in constant, escalating danger. Having renounced the strictures of the Nation of Islam and announced a program of international activism, Malcolm found himself under intense scrutiny from enemies old and new. The repercussions were immediate and chilling, casting a shadow over his every movement and utterance in the final year of his life. Malcolm's public break with the Nation of Islam unleashed a torrent of personal and organizational enmity. Former comrades regarded him as a traitor. Some went so far as to circulate threats against his person and family. The nation held significant resources, including loyal followers capable of enforcing discipline through intimidation or worse. Reports surfaced of Malcolm's residence being firebombed, anonymous calls of menace, and organized campaigns to disrupt his speaking engagements. The once solid fraternity had become a crucible of suspicion, danger, and betrayal. This climate of threat was not contained to the Nation of Islam. By 1964, Malcolm's approach, international, radical, and increasingly confrontational, had begun to alarm U.S. government agencies. Surveillance, which had previously tracked his activities as a prominent Black leader, now intensified and diversified. The FBI, NYPD, and other law enforcement bodies invested considerable resources in monitoring Malcolm's travels, intercepting his communications and compiling dossiers. His phone lines were tapped. Agents attended his events and infiltrated his circles. Even abroad, Malcolm was shadowed by intelligence operatives, wary of his meetings with revolutionary leaders in Africa and the Middle East. Psychologically, this pressure must have been immense. Malcolm wrote and spoke often of the sense of being encircled not only by threats to his safety, but by campaigns to discredit him politically. He faced growing challenges in securing spaces for public speaking. Journalists, once eager for his perspective, now approached with suspicion, probing for signs of instability or extremism. The cost extended to his immediate family, who lived Under the constant dread of attack or reprisal, isolation crept in, wearing at the fabric of Malcolm's resolve. He was compelled to navigate shifting alliances. Friends and supporters were lost as quickly as gained. Paranoia became a necessity, not a weakness. Trust fractured, and each new engagement, whether political meeting or public rally, carried the specter of infiltration or violence. Yet, against the cumulative burden of danger, Malcolm persevered. His voice, while constrained by circumstance, grew ever more stubbornly clear about the need for justice, dignity, and solidarity. Malcolm's isolation was only heightened by the ambiguity surrounding official protections. Although he occasionally received police details, he was quick to note that their presence seemed more intent on surveillance than genuine security. The federal government's refusal to treat threats against black leaders with gravity ensured a climate of vulnerability. Unlike other prominent activists who could rely on organizational or governmental shields, Malcolm's independence rendered him particularly exposed. In public forums, he continued to speak out against injustice, refusing to be cowed by the tide of menace. He held forums across America and abroad, engaging audiences in pressing discussions about self-defense, black identity, and international solidarity. The message resonated, but at each juncture, the risks multiplied. His decision to bring the plight of black Americans before the world rather than confining it to domestic channels increased suspicions about foreign influence and potential subversion. As the threats mounted, Malcolm refused to retreat. He took measures to guard his family and himself, but he was unwavering in his commitment to truth and justice. Isolation became, paradoxically, both a crucible of suffering and a source of clarity. Stripped of institutional buffers, Malcolm's activism sharpened into pure resolve. His enemies had succeeded in making him a man alone, but they could not silence the vision that drove him onward, a vision uncompromising, unyielding, and forever unfinished. Chapter 15. Fire in the Audubon Ballroom. The Assassination. The final chapter in Malcolm X's life began not with the triumphant crescendo one might expect for a leader of his stature, but with the ominous, towing echo of danger long foretold. The Audubon Ballroom, nestled in Harlem, was to be the setting for another passionate address, a gathering that would, instead, become the site of tragedy reverberating across history. On February 21st, 1965, Malcolm X arrived at the ballroom, accompanied by family, friends, and loyal supporters of the Organization of Afro-American Unity. Despite persistent threats, he remained committed to engagement, determined that dialogue and public speech were critical to the sustainment of collective struggle. The audience comprised a cross-section of New York's activist community, longtime followers, new converts, and curious observers, all drawn to Malcolm's charisma and vision. Malcolm began his remarks, as he always did, with humility, invoking the purpose and unity underlying his activism. But moments into his address, the gathering was shattered by violence. A commotion erupted. Gunmen surged from the crowd, weapons drawn. An eruption of chaos ensued. People screamed. Chairs toppled, and shots rang out with devastating clarity. Malcolm X was struck multiple times, collapsing on the stage as his daughters and wife cried out in horror. The aftermath was harrowing. Malcolm died almost instantaneously, felled by the brutality of men who saw in him a threat, be it to power, orthodoxy, or the status quo. The murder was both a culmination and a beginning. The silence that followed his death would soon be replaced by the clamor of grief, outrage, and inquiry. Speculation about the motivations and orchestration of the assassination was immediate and intense. Many pointed to the Nation of Islam, whose rhetoric against Malcolm had accelerated drastically in the preceding months. Others suggested the involvement, or at least tacit approval, of government operatives anxious to quell Malcolm's growing influence on both domestic and international stages. The true intricacies of conspiracy continue to be debated, but what remains beyond doubt is that Malcolm was targeted precisely because his voice could no longer be contained within the bounds of tradition or authority. The significance of the assassination stretches beyond the event itself. It marked the end of an era, stripping the civil rights movement of its most radical and uncompromising leader. For his family, the price was immediate and personal lifelong trauma, constant reminders of what had been lost. For his supporters, the assassination signaled that resistance to systemic injustice carried existential risk. Yet, even in death, Malcolm X's legacy persisted. His ideas, laid out in public speeches and writings, refused extinction. The Audubon Ballroom became a shrine of remembrance and inquiry, a symbolic locus for reflection on the costs and necessity of dissent. Malcolm's final moments, public, tragic, and defiant, etched themselves onto the consciousness of the nation, a spectre haunting both the perpetrators and the institutions that failed to protect him. In time, the fire of that night would illuminate more than a single loss. It would compel movements to reckon with the dangers facing those who sought to transcend division and speak untamed truth. Malcolm X's death, as much as his life, taught future generations that the pursuit of justice requires both courage and vigilance, and that the forces arrayed against change are as persistent as they are lethal. Chapter 16: Shockwaves Across America and the World. From the moment Malcolm X stepped onto the stage of American public life, the shockwaves he generated were immediate and profound. It was not merely the force of his words, but the context in which he uttered them, a period fraught with civil unrest, racial terror, and the slow, often painful birthing of a new social consciousness. Malcolm X's rhetoric, marked by its piercing clarity and refusal to conform, cut through the fog of complacency that had often suffocated real discourse on race in America. Malcolm's rise was anything but quiet. As the chief spokesperson for the Nation of Islam, he engulfed audiences with messages that challenged the very fabric of American identity. No longer would Black Americans suffer in silence or accept half measures of justice. Instead, Malcolm X exhorted his listeners to recognize their collective strength, to embrace blackness not as a burden, but as a badge of honor. His sermons outlined a lens through which Black people could see their oppression, not as a personal failing, but as a systemic injustice, thus catalyzing a sense of collective empowerment. His speeches were quickly disseminated through newspapers, radio, and the nascent medium of television, reaching both Black and white audiences alike. Many viewed him with fear, a Black messiah threatening the status quo. Others saw a liberator, speaking truths long denied. Malcolm's famous dictum, "by any means necessary," ignited debates far beyond the realm of civil rights. It signaled a paradigm shift, one in which resistance was no longer rhetorical, but was viewed as an existential imperative. The reaction was global. In Ghana, Nigeria, and other emerging African nations, Malcolm X's call for self-determination resonated with the anti-colonial mood. Diplomatic correspondence reveals that his engagements during international tours were keenly watched by governments, as they understood that Malcolm's advocacy represented a bridge between African and African American struggles. In Paris, London, and Stockholm, intellectual circles debated the meaning of Malcolm X's insistence that Black Americans were victims not only of discrimination but of a unique form of cultural and psychological colonization. At home, the media's portrayal of Malcolm X was bifurcated. He was either the dangerous agitator or the clear-eyed prophet, depending on the outlet's political leanings. The Federal Bureau of Investigation kept extensive files on him, seeing in his rising popularity a threat to national security. In contrast, grassroots organizations, including the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee (SNCC) and urban coalitions, found inspiration in his forthrightness. Young activists flocked to hear him speak, eager to carry the torch of his message. Malcolm's impact was not merely ideological. In northern cities such as Detroit, New York, and Chicago, his speeches became organizational blueprints, shaping local struggles against police brutality, housing discrimination, and unemployment. His influence was palpable in the architecture of urban rebellions and in the educational curricula of community-based schools. Local leaders cited Malcolm X's exhortations as justification for their own resistance, grounding their actions in his uncompromising stance. Furthermore, Malcolm X's message found fertile ground among artists, musicians, and intellectuals. Figures such as James Baldwin, Maya Angelou, and Amiri Baraka engaged with his writings, integrating his emphasis on black pride and justice into literature, theater, and poetry. Jazz musicians improvised elegies in his honor, reflecting the turbulence and energy that marked his life. The international shockwaves extended to policy debates at the United Nations. Malcolm X's insistence on framing black oppression as a violation of human rights forced a reconsideration of racial issues as not merely a domestic concern, but as a question of global justice. He famously sought to internationalize the black struggle, proposing that African nations support the cause of African Americans on the world stage. Though controversial, his approach catalyzed new forms of solidarity among oppressed groups worldwide. In the wake of his assassination, the shockwaves did not abate. Instead, they intensified. His death was mourned not only in Harlem but in cities across the globe. For many, Malcolm X became a martyr, the embodiment of uncompromising resolve in pursuit of freedom. Memorials sprang up spontaneously, and his speeches continued to circulate, fueling resistance movements in South Africa, the Caribbean, and the United States. The legacy of these shockwaves is unmistakable. Malcolm X wove together the threads of Black American pain, hope, and defiance, creating an enduring tapestry that continues to inspire engagement and transformation. Even decades after his passing, the echoes of his challenge remain potent, daring new generations to confront injustice head-on. In sum, Malcolm X's impact was seismic in magnitude and lasting in duration. His voice, charged with urgency and uncompromising principle, sent reverberations through the structures of power and oppression worldwide. These shockwaves, far from dissipating, have become permanent currents in the ongoing struggle for justice. The world is continually changed, reordered, and awakened by the memory and message of Malcolm X. Chapter 17, The Autobiography, A Voice That Would Not Die. The publication of the Autobiography of Malcolm X marked a watershed in American literature and civil rights documentation, born of collaboration between Malcolm X and journalist Alex Haley. The book set forth a literary record not only of the author's life, but of the psychological and societal transformations that framed modern black consciousness. More than a memoir, the autobiography became a living testament, a voice that would not die. Written in the final months of his life, the autobiography charts Malcolm X's journey from childhood in Omaha and Lansing, shaped by the violent death of his father and the institutionalization of his mother, through a tumultuous adolescence marked by crime and incarceration. His earliest years were emblematic of the broader black experience in America: fractured families, limited opportunities, and persistent threats from white supremacist violence. Yet, these harsh realities, as depicted in his memoir, did not extinguish hope. They became the crucible in which his resolve was forged. The autobiography's narrative arc mirrors the ideological transformation that Malcolm X underwent. In prison, he encountered the teachings of the Nation of Islam, converted enthusiastically, and quickly rose to become its most prominent public voice. The book recounts his experience with electrifying clarity, his deep study of religion, philosophy, and history, as well as his growing disenchantment with the limitations of the nation's doctrine. The moments of doubt and dissent are given unvarnished attention, revealing Malcolm X as a thinker who questioned not only America's racial hierarchy, but also the limits of his own worldview. The literary style of the autobiography is immediate and unadorned, aligning with Malcolm's preference for confrontation over rhetorical flourish. The chronology of his life is punctuated by moments of insight that transcend autobiographical detail, inviting readers into the moral and intellectual dilemmas that shaped his activism. The honesty with which Malcolm X recounts his failings, his criminal life, addiction, and earlier biases stands as a powerful repudiation of respectability politics. Through these confessions, he illuminated the possibility of radical transformation not only for individuals, but for communities. Upon publication, The autobiography was both celebrated and condemned. Mainstream critics, predominantly white, expressed discomfort with the book's uncompromising tone. Nonetheless, it soared in popularity, particularly among African American readers and international audiences. For many, the autobiography functioned as both a mirror and a lamp. It reflected their pain and struggles, and simultaneously illuminated pathways toward liberation. It demonstrated that the voice of resistance need not be stilled by institutional violence, that the Black experience was worthy of deep literary and philosophical exploration. The enduring influence of the autobiography stems from its capacity to humanize its author, while magnifying the collective stakes of his life's work. The book has served as a touchstone for successive generations. Students, activists, and scholars have found in its pages the vocabulary for discussing race, justice, and self-determination. Its chapters continue to be assigned in classrooms, dissected in book clubs, and quoted extensively in public forums. The autobiography's impact is far-reaching, shaping not only literature but the contours of social movements. Malcolm X's autobiography also played a crucial role in redefining the methodology of historical narrative. By centering the voice of the oppressed, it challenged dominant forms of historiography, demanding that the stories of those marginalized be considered central to the record of civilization. The autobiography inaugurated a tradition of radical storytelling, inspiring works such as Assata Shocker's Assata and Angela Davis's An Autobiography. Through its example, the personal became undeniably political. Film adaptations, stage productions, and artistic homages have expanded the influence of the autobiography beyond the written word. Spike Lee's film Malcolm X, for instance, drew extensively from this text, reaffirming its role as an inexhaustible source of inspiration. Visual artists and musicians have translated its themes into mural, lyric, and performance, emphasizing Malcolm's place in the iconography of resistance internationally. The autobiography has reached diverse audiences, offering lessons and hope to people struggling against colonialism, apartheid, and authoritarianism. Translated into dozens of languages, Malcolm's story has become a universal parable of resilience and redemptive change. Whether in South African townships or Parisian banlieues, young readers have discovered in Malcolm X's words a model for the assertion of dignity against systems of dehumanization. Above all, the autobiography's greatest achievement is its refusal to allow Malcolm X's voice to die. It ensures that, even as its author was silenced, the ideas and insights animating his vision endure and multiply. The work is not an epitaph, but a rallying cry preserved on the printed page, carried in the hearts of those who read it. Malcolm X's autobiography continues to provoke and inspire, calling every generation to interrogate the meaning of justice and the necessity of personal transformation. By narrating the story of a man who refused silence, it bequeaths to the world a voice that resists easy categorization, a voice that, decades later, remains alive, insistent, and essential. The autobiography is evidence that some messages, when spoken from the depths of truth, can never be extinguished. Chapter 18: Malcolm X and the Black Power Movement. Malcolm X's relationship to the Black Power movement is both foundational and complex. Although the term Black Power rose to prominence after his death, Malcolm X's ideas, language, and strategies shaped its emergence and character. His influence on activists and organizations, his impact on ideological and tactical debates, and his enduring symbolic role make him an indispensable figure in the Black Power narrative. Before the ascendancy of Black Power, the civil rights movement was largely defined by the pursuit of integration through non-violent resistance. Leaders such as Martin Luther King Jr. advocated for racial coexistence and constitutional reform grounded in moral appeals. Malcolm X, in contrast, advocated for separatism, self-defense, and self-reliance. His critique of non-violence was rooted in a practical understanding of American racial dynamics. He argued that non-violence benefited oppressors more than the oppressed. Malcolm X urged Black Americans to embrace and celebrate their identity, Reversing the psychological damage inflicted by centuries of racism, he popularized the slogan, "You don't have to beg for a job, you can create a job," emphasizing economic empowerment as the cornerstone of real liberation. His speeches and writings laid the groundwork for subsequent Black Power activists, who promoted community control of resources and institutions. Key figures such as Stokely Carmichael, later Quaintor, and Huey P. Newton cited Malcolm X's teachings as decisive influences. Carmichael's call for Black Power at a 1966 rally in Mississippi signaled a direct line of intellectual inheritance. Malcolm's insistence on self-definition, self-defense, and global solidarity became foundational pillars of the movement. The Black Panther Party, founded in Oakland, modeled itself on Malcolm's vision, blending his commitment to armed self-defense with community service programs, such as free breakfast initiatives and health clinics. Malcolm X's approach to coalition building was equally significant. He understood that Black liberation was not isolated, but must be linked to broader struggles against imperialism and colonialism. His outreach to African leaders, his critique of Western capitalism, and his willingness to forge alliances with progressive white individuals and organizations widened the horizon of Black Power beyond national boundaries. In rhetoric and action, Malcolm challenged the limitations of American democracy. He was a master of the media, turning interviews and public debates into platforms for radical ideas. His speeches, meticulously crafted yet spontaneous in delivery, reached far beyond the confines of religious meetings or political rallies. Millions heard his voice through television broadcasts and radio interviews, and his uncompromising tone forced a re-evaluation of what resistance could entail. Malcolm's critique of integration rested not on antagonism for its own sake, but on a clear-eyed vision of structural reality. He contended that integration without justice amounted to a hollow gesture, masking deeper forms of exploitation. This perspective proved influential among Black Power militants, who sought to build parallel institutions rather than assimilate into those designed to marginalize. The intersection of cultural pride and political activism was a hallmark of Malcolm X's philosophy. He recognized the role of language, style, and art in resistance. He told his followers to reclaim your history, your name, your identity. This cultural renaissance manifest in the Black Arts movement and the popularization of African hairstyles, dress, and music was rooted in Malcolm's call for self-love and pride. Critics accused Malcolm X of fostering division, but his approach was best understood as an effort to heal and empower. By insisting on truth-telling, he challenged Black Americans to confront painful realities and refused to dilute his message. To accommodate white comfort, he articulated the pain of communities ignored by mainstream reform and gave them the tools to imagine something better. Despite differences in tactics and philosophy, the Black Power movement found in Malcolm X a wellspring of inspiration. His sermons and essays were cited at rallies, distributed in leaflets, and used as organizing guides. The radical wings of SNCC, the Pan-Africanist Congress, and Caribbean liberation movements adopted his emphases on unity, self-defense, and dignity. Malcolm's legacy within Black Power is also reflected in the intellectual arena. His analysis of American racism as a system rather than a set of individual prejudices informed critical race theory and contemporary social analysis. His willingness to reassess his own beliefs, most notably after his pilgrimage to Mecca, modeled an openness in ideology that proved vital as the movement evolved. In sum, Malcolm X did not merely anticipate or inspire Black Power, he helped constitute its very possibility. His life and ideas made clear that liberation required not only resistance to oppression, but also the creation of new modes of being. This notion continues to animate struggles against injustice today, ensuring that his contribution is remembered, not only as a historical fact, but as a living principle. Through his enduring voice, Malcolm X remains entwined with the legacy of Black Power, a legacy grounded in self-assertion, resilience, and the unapologetic pursuit of human dignity. The resonance of his message is a continual call to reimagine resistance, to move from accommodation to transformation, and to honor the radical potential within oppressed communities. Chapter 19, A Legacy of Courage, Truth and Defiance. In the archives of human experience. Legacies are seldom built overnight. They are the harvested fruit of countless seeds sown in moments of choice, adversity, and conviction. The story of legacy, particularly one cemented in courage, truth, and defiance, spans not only generations but also transcends boundaries of creed, culture, and circumstance. Courage, the first foundation, manifests not only in grand gestures, but also in the subtle, daily refusals to submit to fear. Consider the chronicles of clandestine resistance movements that flourished under oppressive regimes. Their members seldom bore the outward trappings of heroism. Often, they blended into the mundane fabric of society. Yet, with each covert message passed, each forbidden pamphlet distributed, their valor found quiet expression. There exist recorded tales, such as the Defiance of Sophie Scholl and the White Rose Group in Nazi Germany. Though young and seemingly powerless, Sophie chose to confront the machinery of terror with leaflets, the written truth wielded as a weapon of conscience. Her unwavering determination, culminating in her execution, reverberates as an enduring legacy not only of individual stamina, but of the capacity for moral resistance in the darkest of times. Truth is inexorably entwined with the fabric of legacy. In an era where falsehood can shape destinies, those who defend the sanctity of fact and transparency shoulder a burden that can be overwhelming. The legacy of truth-tellers rests not merely on uncovering deception, but on the arduous journey to sustain honesty at the cost of personal welfare. Investigative journalists such as Anna Politkovskaya, who dared expose corruption in turbulent political landscapes, embody a legacy that persists beyond their mortal presence. Her words, still evoking discomfort and contemplation, have lit torches for successors braving similar peril. Defiance is the stance adopted when the world demands silence or acquiescence. Yet defiance, contrary to popular belief, does not germinate in rage. It blooms in the soil of justice denied, rights trampled, and hope assailed. The march of Martin Luther King, Jr. across the Edmund Pettus Bridge encapsulates a legacy measured in both endurance and transformation. With each step, the boundaries of acceptable defiance widened, and generations hence recall the possibility embedded in a single, resolute act. A legacy of courage, truth, and defiance is not merely historical, it is a perpetual inheritance, passed down to those willing to shoulder its weight. It is found in the whispered encouragement of a parent urging a child to speak frankly, or in the teacher who fosters critical thinking amid uniformity. It is captured in the artist whose pen critiques unjust systems with satire, and in the scientist who refuses to falsify data even when threatened with professional ruin. Societies constructed on such legacies are resilient, for their citizens have internalized the lessons of audacity and candor. They understand that progress demands more than passive hope. It requires the active challenge of convention. Yet the transfer of this legacy relies on remembrance, on deliberate education, on the retelling of stories both triumphant and tragic. Within these pages, we examine not only the outward symbols of bravery and defiance, but also the quieter currents that sustain them. We reflect upon how families, communities, and institutions internalize principles and convey them across temporal divides. We consider the cost sometimes paid in blood, always counted in sacrifice, and the reward, which may be intangible, but is ultimately immeasurable in the freedom and dignity gained. A legacy forged on courage, truth, and defiance is the bedrock of civilization's progress. It acts as a bulwark against regression and apathy, demanding that each generation consider how and for whom they will wield their own echoes of valor. Chapter 20, The Voice That Still Echoes. The phenomenon of the enduring voice is an enigma both of memory and impact. To hear a voice echoing through the corridors of time is to witness a transcendence beyond mortality, the preservation of principle, and passion that shapes thought and action long after the originator has departed the stage. The voice that still echoes is seldom singular. It is a harmony wrought from many timber speeches, writings, protests, and acts of conscience that together comprise an anthem for posterity. At its heart, Such a voice is bound by truth, galvanized by courage, and immortalized by defiance. Nelson Mandela's declarations during his lengthy imprisonment encapsulate the power of the enduring voice. Confined within the walls of Robben Island, isolated from the world, the resonance of his words reached far beyond his cell. "I am prepared to die," Mandela declared, not as a verdict of resignation, but as an assertion of unconquered will. His voice, at once quiet and thunderous, has continued to inspire generations wrestling with injustice and reconciliation. Similarly, Malala Yousafzai's address to the United Nations, despite her youth and suffering, remains a touchstone for advocates of education and equality. Her words, simple yet fervent, have achieved global reverberation, forging alliances and radical empathy across continents. The echo of Malala's voice reminds us that age, status, or circumstance cannot mute authenticity and conviction. The mechanism through which a voice achieves permanence is complex. Technology plays a role archiving written and multimedia records, so that future seekers may commune with voices past. Yet technology alone cannot ensure resonance. For the echo to persist, it must be rooted in universal truths, in struggles and victories that speak to the common human experience. The voice must articulate the unspoken, call out the unseen, and risk pointing to uncomfortable realities. The echoing voice does not always belong to the famous. Unsung heroes exist. A small-town lawyer advocating for environmental justice, a student penning manifestos against censorship, a physician risking life for humanitarian relief in war zones. Their testimonies gather momentum as peers, protégés, and journalists amplify the message echoing across communities and, sometimes, around the world. Yet, the entrance of a voice is also contingent upon receptivity, a listening society, willing to treasure hard truths, revisit uncomfortable histories, and adapt in response. Silence is the grave of legacies, but attentive remembrance is their resurrection. This dynamic interplay between utterance and audience underscores the necessity of education, open discourse, and pluralism to sustain the voice that still echoes. Society must do more than commemorate. It must integrate the teachings of valor and honesty into its institutions and daily rituals. Monuments and museum walls are ephemeral. Living history is written in kitchens, classrooms, and council halls, where echoes form around choices both grand and humble. As we probe the stories that animate this chapter, we must ask, what enables some voices to endure while others fade into obscurity? How can present voices ensure that their defiance and truth are not merely noises in the void, but symphonies recorded in the hearts of successor generations? The answers, perhaps, reside in courage paired with compassion, in the honesty that risks alienation, and in the defiance that refuses to be muted. The voice that still echoes is constructed painstakingly, nurtured daringly, and preserved lovingly, a phenomenon as sacred as it is revolutionary.